Hello learners and listeners. I Dr. G. Uma along with me Dr. Smita Patel. We are going to discuss the women and political process in today's session. Before we discuss about the topic, I would like to explain the objectives of the today's session. We will see the objectives of the today's lecture. We have taken 4 objectives today. The first objective is to explain the feminist understanding of women and political process, discuss the significance of increasing women's representation in legislative bodies, analyze the barriers for increasing women's representation in the electoral process, and examine the role of women as agents of change at the public space. First, we will start explaining the first objective. Now, Dr. Smita Patel will explain the first objective.
Let me just get into this debate of what is political. Now, it's been very important to understand that before we get into the discourse of women and political process, to understand the political philosophy, which is a background of this. We do talk about the women and political process, but it did not emerge suddenly. It has a long history, so let us engage with that.
First, we'll talk about the conventional understanding of the political. In the conventional understanding, it has a liberal political discourse, and they talked about the sovereign nation state. The conventional understanding insists on the idea of separation of individual citizen and the state, and they have insist the idea of separation of public and private life, and they use the term political, and this term is mostly refers from the Western context.
Let me explain in detail what does it mean, the liberal political. Try to understand this whole discourse. Now, the modern understanding of the political, which we derive actually from the liberal feminist. We do talk that liberalism which emerged do talk about the equality, freedom and the notion of justice. These 3 important categories which engages us as a feminist to liberate ourselves from a number of discourses, whether we get into politics, and then if we look at the conventional understanding of it, then you could see that conventional understanding was quite rigid understanding. For instance, the conventional understanding was that
there is a clear separation of public and private life.
Distinction in which that you could understand, because we have to go back again the Greek tradition. In the Greek tradition, for instance, that if we actually draw the 3 important Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, we could relate these 3 important philosophers of the Greek tradition to have a further dialogue on political philosophy. For instance, the Socrates used to deliver sort of lectures. It was never been in a way recorded or written, but Plato used to attend his talks every day. So, in a Greek tradition, it was a fundamental, act that Greek was a republic. So, the number of republics were there, like Athens, Sparta, etc. And in that tradition, people come together. It's a community participation, you could see. It's a people coming together and taking a decision in the collective, in which is in interest of the people. So therefore, you could see that in Socrates does talk about that, and Plato was highly influential with that. So if you engage and read the Western political philosophy, there's this debate that that Plato was highly influenced with Socrates, and you could see that Plato wrote Republic. One of the he wrote number of actually the books, and his contribution is major in political philosophy also. But then the 2 important books which I want to insist is, one is the Republic, the other is the Statements. These 2 books actually does talk about that how the statesmanship should work, how the law should be formed, and more interestingly that in the Greek tradition you could see that the decision which is taken in one republic actually implement in several places in a similar manner. So there is no discrepancy or sort of differences between that. So the rule of law was actually implemented through this. And then you could see the 3rd important contribution later on is the Aristotle. Aristotle wrote also, and if you're really interested, you can look at some of the very interesting book as a beginner the story of the history, the story of the philosophy of history, and then by Will Doot. Then another book is that in context of the history of the Greek philosophy by Guntre, and then Ernest Barker also wrote Aristotle. Aristotle wrote Politics, which is one of the important intervention which engages us, and this dichotomy which we talk about public and private, Aristotle was totally different from that. Now for the Plato, it was much different from the other, because in a republic, in a Greek tradition, if you look at, the women were not supposed to be allowed to enter into public domain. So you could say the public and private, these two categories were distinguished, and you could see the dichotomy between public and private categorically. So women, children and the foreigners were not to be allowed. But Aristotle in fact changed this discourse, and he says the person who get into a public life, who is apolitical, the person or the citizens or the member of the society who never engages with the society are a political person. So you could see this dichotomy between public and private, and you could understand and relate even today. So the modern political thought actually brought in the important intervention on the discourse of autonomy, and challenges this traditional conventional discourse of the political, where the modern political thinkers do talk about the intervention of the liberals. Now in the context of the liberals, liberal philosophers, for instance J.S. Mill, who has written a book also, Subjugation of Women, and then with the influence of J.S. Mill, it's a Mary Wollstonecraft also written one book in 1792 called Vindication of Rights of Women. These are the very important intervention to take further when one talks about the liberals and liberal feminists. Now what does liberal feminists talk about? They draw the arguments from the liberals by saying that women are equally rational, and there is reason and rationality which also engages them, which was denied by them by the conventional philosopher. For instance, that the virtue, the reason, and the way in which women were looked at by this philosopher, the Greek traditional philosopher, that it is their domain. I would also emphasize all of you, dear learners, to look into this very interesting medieval philosophy, because it engages you and take you, for instance, from 5th century BC to 15th century till now. You would see that, for instance, Hegel was there, Marx was there, then Durkheim and the other people, others like John Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau. These are very important actually, Augustine. These are all very important philosophers from the European history, and one should also engage to understand this. If you really engage and try to understand, then you can today you can make out why it's important to do the intervention even in the discourse of the citizenship further, which we'll discuss in the later part.
Actually, they have considered polis is political. Polis refers to the Greek city, state, implying the shared space and community. In the Greek classical understanding, political refers to the shared context of community living and decisions taken within the community. Usually, adult who owns the property, they constitute the polis. As Dr. Smita Patel pointed out, the political rights are given to the male members during that period, earlier period, and the idea of political hinged upon the idea of community and participation. There is no difference between the public and private, but less women they have participated in the public life. With regard to power and the political in the medieval Europe, there are new kind of life began with the trade and mercantilism.
I just want to add
Politics came with the assertion of power and force. There is a distinction between the public and private in the medieval Europe, on which modern understanding of politics emerged, and excluding women from the public. Women mostly they were confined to the private space, and they thought that they have to maintain the family and the children, and they have given the mostly reproductive work and taking care of the entire private space. Hegel drew ethical life of a woman within a family and that of a man. Husband is the citizen of self-consciousness and woman as a wife and mother.
I just want to add on that Hegel was one of the German political philosopher who does talk about, the political philosophy, religion, phenomenology of the mind, and phenomenology of the spirit. Now, Hegel also actually contributed something called Geist, which we call it spirit. Geist is a German word. And Hegel's contribution, as Dr. G. Uma pointed out, that he draws this two distinction. Unlike that, the other medieval philosopher which I have mentioned, Rousseau was one of them who talk about the distinction between public and private, and the private spaces for the woman, and the woman who should look into the household, the family, and the children. Now, there are certain shifts which engage with that further.
Actually, modern political understanding, it came from the liberal understanding and talks about the individualism, universalism, egalitarian society, and ameliorism. All individuals, according to modern political philosophy, all individuals are equal and human beings possess a rationality. Unlike in a medieval and earlier period, there they categorically said that the women, they lack rationality, men only they have a rational human being. That's why they can participate in the public sphere. But in the modern political philosopher, according to modern political philosophy, the women too possess the rationality. So liberal feminists argued that women too possess rationality, and therefore they are equal to men.
I just want to add on that political philosophers do talk about the reason, rationality, virtue. Now, these are very important things, and Mary Wollstonecraft, actually in the Vindication of Rights of Women, talks about this very categorically. We as a woman also have this, the right. If you look at and analyze her book, it is even today very, very relevant, where one actually draws certain arguments from that, and you could see that eventually in 1840 in US, the Convention of the Civil Rights, you could see the voting rights that the American woman actually talked and fought around 100 years to get the voting rights, which didn't happen in the Indian case. But yes, the reason and rationality is the base, and we as a woman also have a reason and rational, and we can also think. Because if you also go back and look at the political philosophy, that the way in which the political philosophy and the human nature actually formulated, it was an assumption that woman doesn't have the mind, they cannot actually go and think further. So the all decision makings, everything was under the domain of the male. So the patriarchal construction which was there, which actually strengthened the conventional understanding which the liberal feminist or the modern political process actually try to liberate from the traditional views.
Actually, freedom, autonomy, participation in the political space, it is not available for the women in the medieval and early period. So most of in the medieval period and early feminists, they tried to establish the women's ability to engage and the reasoned deliberations. So that is the first feminists, they started doing that. Feminist theory and politics had to contend with the notion of power and trying to redefine politics to make the women's presence, involvement and participation in the public life. In that way only the feminist movement has started to make the women to participate in the public space.
I just want dear listeners to engage with some of the readings which I would like to recommend to all of you. One is the very interesting book by Valerie Bryson. It's called The Feminist Theory, and it's an introduction. So this is a beginner book where you can engage with that, how the entire discourse from the liberal, Marxist, socialist and radical feminist emerge, and then how the feminists engage with this debate over a period of time. The another book which I would really want you to read is by Alison Jagger, in which you could see that the political philosophy and human nature, that how this whole debate from Descartes to then Hegel and the other philosophers took up, and how feminists engage over a period of time. Like for instance, if you look at the modern writings, of some of the philosophers who engages with this debate of the agency power. Some of them are Nancy Fraser, Carol Patman, and you could also see Iris Marius Young, and many others I could mention to you, or Judith Square.
Actually, feminist perspective on political is that modernity and political, that their idea of politics has emerged from the liberal feminism, and they categorically told that the personal is political, and if that it's a personal is political, they started questioning the privacy.
Yeah.
Actually, and they wanted to make the women's voice heard, because so far women's voice is marginalized.
I just want to engage this question of the public, private, and then the privacy. Because since woman was into the fourfold of the household, then what is happening inside, and the women were not able to take the decision even in the household. And you can relate this debate in your everyday life categorically to see that how patriarchy operates. Are women really taking a decision or not? So this debate was challenged, and you could see the public-private dichotomy is still existing, even though it is challenged by the feminists. One of the important things is that the margin feminism. If we relate in the contemporary context, the emergence of the tribal and Dalit feminists in India, you can see that the way in which they are claiming. Now, location and experience is one of the departure point for the feminist again, and you could relate this debate at length from the black feminist to Dalit feminist to the tribal feminist, or even the feminist who does talk about the identity politics. That in that context also the Islamic feminist also comes into that fold. So you could see that these feminists, those who are in the margin, keep challenging, and they do talk about the location and the experience. They say that our location is different, therefore our experiences are different, and therefore they contest this whole debate of again further to agency, freedom, the notion of freedom, agency, justice. These are very three important categories which they keep questioning time and again.
Actually, we were talking about and we were explaining about the how the feminism has emerged during the early period and medieval period. With regard to that is overall, we were discussed about the feminist scenario throughout the world. Now we will come to the feminism with regard to Indian context. With the Indian context, first we need to discuss feminism in the context of the political process. Actually, in the post-independence India, the women's agency is defined, and that our constitution itself, they have provided rights, and they have constitution clearly defined what is citizenship, and the citizenship also from a gender perspective, and how even their constitution equally provide the rights for each and every citizen in the country. So we need to discuss in the post-independence India, like we need to see what is concepts of political agency and what are the rights, natural rights, liberty rights, individual rights and universal rights, that we need to understand, and we need to understand what is citizenship, and citizenship also from a gender perspective, and what is participation and representation. With regard to post-independence India, state has developed definite concept on the political process. We will explain few concepts. First, we will talk about the political agency. With political agency is defined through the rights. Rights are the fundamental normative rules. They are meant for the people or owned to the people. Different thinkers define rights in a different way. For example, natural rights are the rights which are natural and do not derived from any specific society. They exist naturally and inherited by every individual. Example, all human beings, we have a natural rights and we have rights to live natural form. With regard to liberty rights, it is simply a freedom or permission for the right holders to do something. For example, if a person has a legal liberty for speech, he can able to do the free speech, and the government also, they cannot interfere in their free speech. With regard to individual rights, every individual has a own rights. For example, even individual is part of the any group, he can possess the rights. Individual rights means he can, according to our Indian constitution, he can move anywhere, and he can buy property anywhere in the country. He can possess the property, and he can freely travel from one parts to other parts. He can express his feelings through writings or through speech. We will talk about universal rights. Everybody has a right to confess, right to educate themselves, right to buy a property, and individual has a right to have a decent life. So in our constitution itself, in the post-independence India, definitely given certain rights, and these constitutional provisions, for example, Article 14 guarantees the equality before law for women, and Article 15 prohibits the discrimination of any citizens on grounds of sex, religion, race, caste, place of birth, any of them, and Article 16 guarantees for all the citizens equally of opportunity in matters of public life. So far we talked about the contemporary guarantees given by the Constitution of India, and also we discussed about the political process in the early period and medieval period and modern period, and the interference of the political philosophers with regard to giving equal rights to the women. So we have given the clear picture about the contribution of the political philosophers and the feminists to give the equal rights for the women in the political process. Thank you.